All right, hey there, Euro Bears. This is a recorded slideshow lecture on Napoleon III. Originally Louis Napoleon, the president of the French Second Republic, he, just like his uncle, decided to overthrow the government and make himself emperor and France an empire. And once he is emperor, France goes through two distinct stages before being conquered by the Germans in 1870 and Napoleon III being driven out of the country. So let's learn about the story of Napoleon III. Napoleon III had a Spanish wife. However, Napoleon III, like many French monarchs, was known for his many love interests. All right. So as we talk about the history of France, especially as we get through the 19th century and into the 20th century, France gets complicated in terms of the governments that it has. We in the United States are fairly lucky in terms of the stability of our government over the course of time. The same year that France had a revolution in 1789, we adopted a constitution, and we've had that same constitution since 1789, albeit with amendments and alterations, but we still had the same government. But France, in their experiment with democracy, has not been so lucky. And this honestly might be for better or worse. They've had multiple constitutions over the years. And so what this means for us as students of European history is France is complicated because they have different names for different governments over the course of time. So I thought might be worthwhile right here just to go over all of these governments in French history, both the ones before Napoleon III and the ones after Napoleon III. Let's take it all the way up to present day. Okay, so prior to 1789, you had the old regime, or as the French called it, the Ancien regime, and then in 1789, there is the French Revolution. The First Republic was established then during the French Revolution, which lasted until 1804, when Napoleon, on December the 2nd, 1804, was proclaimed emperor. And then you have the establishment of the First French Empire, which lasted from 1804 until the Battle of Waterloo, 1815. Then you have the Bourbon Restoration of 1815, which actually technically started in 1814 when Napoleon was driven out to Elba, but never mind all that. So you've got the Bourbon Restoration in 1815, that lasts all the way to the Revolution of 1830, when Charles X was driven out of France. Then you have the establishment of the Orleanist line in France. This was the July monarchy. The July monarchy lasted from 1830 until the revolutions of 1848. And so then we've got the February Revolution in 1848 in France, and the establishment of the French Second Republic, which we learned about not too long ago. The Second Republic then lasts from 1848 until 1852. Of course, the president of the French Second Republic, was Louis Napoleon, who in 1852, just like his uncle Napoleon I, decided to declare himself emperor and establish a second empire. That second empire lasted from 1852 until the Germans conquer France. We'll learn about that in a future lecture in 1870. And then a Third Republic was set up in the year 1871. The French Third Republic is, I believe, still the longest lasting French Republic, lasting just about 70 years. We'll learn more about the French Third Republic. I'm now going into the future beyond the scope of this particular lecture. But just to, give you a little bit of what's to come, the French Third Republic, the longest lasting republic, is remembered for its political instability. There were a lot of groups, some conservative, some liberal, that struggled for control of the government. And so the French Third Republic is remembered for its political instability, even though it lasted a very long time, and it probably was not as unstable as many history textbooks present it to be. But the French Third Republic, the longest lasting republic, that lasted until 1940, and that's when the Nazis took over. So the Nazis ruled France either directly or indirectly from 1940 through 1944. We'll talk more about that during our World War II unit. Then here came the British and the Americans to liberate France. And I guess I should remember, the Canadians too were there to liberate France. In 1944 to 1946, a provisional government was set up. And then there was a Fourth Republic. Fourth Republic had a very strong legislative branch, a very weak executive branch. It lasted for 12 years. And then in 1958, Algeria wanted to break off and go free. This created what we call the Algerian crisis. there was almost a military coup d'etat in 1958. The French government responded by bringing back a World War I and World War II hero named Charles de Gaulle, who took over the government in 1958, had a brief 6-month dictatorship, and then established the French Fifth Republic with a stronger executive branch. And that is the French Republic that exists today. So there you go, an overview of all of these French governments. So it might be worth in your notes just taking down this list of French governments so that you can see how they all line up, and you can refer back to it if need be. Okay, but we're going to focus here on the French Second Empire. After Louis Napoleon declares himself emperor in 1852 and rules France as an emperor. So as emperor of France, there are two distinct periods of his empire. Now that makes this slide a little bit confusing because here I divide Napoleon III's career into 3 distinct phases. The first phase, as it is on the slide, is the Second Republic, which lasted 4 years before Napoleon III just simply overthrew it and declared himself emperor. So when he's emperor for essentially 2 decades, the 1850s and the 1860s. And during these 2 decades, he has a different focus for each decade. I don't think he planned it out like this. It's just sort of how it worked out, which is rather nice for us. So in the 1850s, when the Crimean War was going on, and he's involved in that, his goal at home in France is to develop the economy, which means this. Napoleon III is going to be very supportive of the merchant class, industrial development. In short, he's going to support the rich. He's going to support the bourgeoisie. He is not going to support the working class, which means unions. Unions are illegal. If the working class people don't like their conditions and they decide to organize and go on strike, Napoleon III has no problem taking the French army and crushing those strikes. Napoleon's goal for France in the 1850s is to make them an industrial power that can compete with Britain. Okay, but then the 1860s roll around, and Napoleon III changes his tune. After France has all this economic development in the 1850s, Napoleon III decides that he is going to support the workers. So, trade unions legalized, strikes are allowed. As emperor, he opens up more freedom for speech, assembly, so that the working class people have more of a voice and they can strive to improve their living conditions. All right. It was also during the time of the liberal empire of the 1860s that Napoleon III sponsored something called the Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the Refused. We'll learn more about that later. The end of Napoleon III and the French Empire will happen in 1870 when the Germans invade under a man by the name of Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Prussia at the time. Napoleon III is caught in battle, and he is forced into exile, and of course he goes to England. Hey, Napoleon III, though. Napoleon III is the last monarch of Europe, the last monarch in European history to actually lead men into battle. And he led men into battle while he was emperor. Louis Napoleon was a wild man in his youth, very inspired by his uncle, and that never, ever wore off. It's a bold thing to charge into battle. I mean, have we ever had a president of the United States who led soldiers into battle while he was president? I don't think so, but I also don't know so. All right, so there's 2 distinct phases of France in the 1850s and France in the 1860s. Not going to go into much more depth than that. And that should give us a little bit of insight into the leadership of Napoleon III. In the 1850s, he's really trying to make France this industrial powerhouse just like Britain. In the 1860s, he's really working to revive that French spirit of freedom and the empowerment of all people in society. Okay, Napoleon III is also the monarch who creates modern Paris. So by the time we get to the 1850s, Paris is a very, very old city. And it's a revolutionary city. I mean, more than once, the people of Paris have risen up and taken over the city. And then that led to an all-out revolution around the country. So Napoleon III essentially wants to bulldoze most of Paris and rebuild Paris as a city that cannot be a revolutionary city. And he also wants to make it this grand city, this beautiful city, a city that is truly the envy of the world. And just like sometimes how homeowners look at their home and say, our home looks pretty old, we need an update. And they hire contractors to come in and knock down walls and rip up floors and redo the whole thing. That's pretty much what Napoleon III did with a lot of Paris. And here was the contractor that Napoleon III hired, the architect and designer George Haussmann. And Haussmann went to work redesigning Paris based upon the specifications of Napoleon III. And here's what he designed. Now, when most of us think of Paris today and we think about iconic things in Paris, we think of the Eiffel Tower. But the Eiffel Tower is not going to come around until the 1870s during the period of time of the French Third Republic. That was built for the World's Fair and the centennial of the 1789 French Revolution. So it goes up in 1889. So we're not there yet. Back during the time of Napoleon III, the iconic structure in downtown Paris was what you see here, the Arc de Triomphe. The Arc de Triomphe, or the Arch of Triumph, was constructed in the early 19th century in honor of all of Napoleon I's victories. So the Arc de Triomphe becomes the centerpiece for Napoleon III and George Haussmann's Paris. There's a very large roundabout that goes around the Arc de Triomphe, and then you see all of these very wide thoroughfares branching off in this star-like pattern away from the Arc de Triomphe. Now, here's why Napoleon III wanted George Haussmann to design it like this. Paris, traditionally, is the city of revolution. And as an older city, it had all these small little alleys, skinny little roads, and that made it very easy for the people of Paris. It made it very easy for the people of Paris to take over these little neighborhoods and defend themselves and barricade themselves in defense of the French military. So when you have these huge thoroughfares that you see here on this image, this is an image of modern Paris, of course, but it's the Paris designed by George Haussmann and Napoleon III. These large thoroughfares were good in that they could accommodate an army. So they're good for parades, and there will be many parades that go along this major thoroughfare there. By the way, that main street there in the middle of this image is the Champs-Élysées, And the Champs-Élysées is good for military parades, but it's also good for if in the event that in one of these neighborhoods, these little pie-sliced neighborhoods, there's a revolution and the people try to put up the barricades, the military can get in and out really quick to surround that particular neighborhood, cut them off, and stop the revolution. So that's why Paris was designed like that. And a personal story that I hope you enjoy about the Champs-Élysées. The first time I was ever in Paris, and really the most time I've spent in Paris, was in the late summer of 1996. And I was just there as a recent college graduate, and I was just backpacking around Europe, and I got a chance to spend some time in Paris. And it was late summer of 96. I've been out of the country for a couple of months at this point, and I was feeling very homesick. And I was in downtown Paris, and I was doing some touristy things, and I was walking down the Champs-Élysées, and at my feet on the Champs-Élysées were Buckeye nuts. I kid you not, Buckeyes. There are Buckeye trees on the Champs-Élysées. How did they get Buckeye trees on the Champs-Élysées? I have no clue. Was George Haussmann and Napoleon III involved in that? I don't know. But it was a really cool thing, and it was a great moment for me. I felt a little bit less homesick. So if ever you're on the Champs-Élysées in the late summer, early fall, hey, look for those Buckeye nuts. Here's just an up-close picture of the Arc de Triomphe. It's a huge roundabout. I've never had to drive on it. To actually get to it, there are tunnels under the street. And when you go to it, you can look at things up close. There are the names of all of Napoleon's major battles and friezes and reliefs of images from those battles. Just a big glorification of Napoleon. And now with Haussmann and Napoleon III, Paris is starting to look like Paris with this grand architecture, these wide thoroughfares, these fountains, these statues, these big, beautiful luxurious apartments. Hey, you should go online and check out, see how much it would cost to buy a condo on the Champs-Élysées today. Guarantee you it's probably not cheap. More images, or another image of Haussmann's architecture in downtown Paris. Napoleon III also has this built. Paris can't be a great city without a great opera house. Paris Opera House is built during the reign of Napoleon III. Here's a shot of the interior. Here's another shot of the interior. The one image that I don't have for you, which is sad, I'm sorry I don't have this for you, the ceiling of the Paris Opera House was painted, or I guess probably frescoed, by the famous 20th century French artist Marc Chagall. And it's, in my own personal opinion, beautiful. So in the late 19th century, Paris is expanding, and so is London at this point in time. They've both had an industrial revolution, there's major urbanization, and so there are these major construction projects that are happening in both London and Paris at this time, in the late 19th century. And in both cities, the city planners had to deal with a growing population that's growing into the millions, and how to deal with the problem of sewage. There were cholera outbreaks in the early 19th century, which was really at the dawn of urbanization, and people really didn't understand what cholera was, where it was coming from. And then finally it was discovered that it was coming from particular water pumps that had unclean water in it. These cities needed better sewage systems. So in both Paris and in London, major civil engineering feats were needed to get both running water to the people in all of these new buildings, and the city planners had to get the sewage out so that the people living in these big cities could live safely and in good health. And it's really amazing to think about. When you visit Paris and London today, the sewage systems that they use are the same ones that were built in the late 19th century. Although it's probably the same with major metropolitan areas in the United States too that were developing at this time, cities like New York and Chicago. But you can go visit them, and especially if you're into engineering, might be pretty cool to see how they built all this stuff in the late 19th century. But if ever you want to explore underground Paris, here's the incredible thing that happened as Haussmann gave Paris its facelift. He cleared cemeteries that were ancient. I mean, Paris is an old city going back to the Romans. You had all of these cemeteries filled with people and that nobody knew who they were anymore by the time you get to the late 19th century. And these cemeteries are standing in the way of construction. So when Haussmann's men cleared the cemetery, or the cemeteries, they popped out the coffins, they exhumed the bones, and they stacked them up in catacombs under the city. One of the coolest and creepiest things that you can do if ever you visit Paris is to go visit the catacombs. There are nearly 10 miles of labyrinthine corridors under the city of Paris that are lined with human skeletons. Here's a picture from one of these hallways. Here's another picture from one of those hallways. In this particular image, it identifies which cemetery the bones came from. But you see, each one of these skeleton heads, I mean, there are a lot of people whose remains are down underneath Paris right now. There's 10 miles of this. When you go to visit the catacombs of Paris, you're greeted with this above the entrance. It says, "Stop. Here you are entering the Empire of Death." The workers who created the catacombs kind of went about stacking up the bones in particular geometrical shapes. I think a lot of people who visit the catacombs, myself included, they have a little bit of an existential crisis. Because, when you first walk into the catacombs, you're like, ooh, human remains, cool. But then you walk and you walk and you walk, and you've been walking for like 30 minutes, and it's just skeleton head after skeleton head after skeleton head. And eventually you think, each one of these skeletons is an adult who lived a full life and then who died. And they were a human being just like me, with physical needs and emotional needs. They wanted to be loved. They wanted to be seen as important. And now here they are. This is all that's left. And you start thinking about each one of these little individual skeletons. And it, does put life into perspective a little bit when you visit the catacombs. There is, in the catacombs, a place for church services to be held. It was down here during World War II that the French resistance met to hatch their plots against the occupying Nazi force. Those are the catacombs of Paris. Also, part of Haussmann's New Paris were the world's first shopping centers. Mass consumerism developed in Paris, France in the late 19th century. This is part of the new modern culture. Prior to the late 19th century, if you wanted a new, let's say, shirt, pants, well, you went to the tailor, or you went to your mom, or somebody else who knew how to sew, and they would make you a shirt and a new pair of pants. But now as we enter the late 19th century, we start to have mass production and mass consumerism, and shopping becomes a thing. So this mass consumerism that develops in Paris in the late 19th century is important for two reasons. The first is important for business. There were new business models that were coming around. So think of it like this. If you had your own small little store and you were, making dresses, for example, you're only going to have a handful of customers every week or month or so. People coming in, ordering their dresses, you're making the dresses and selling the dresses. But as businesses start developing and they can create these large merchandise stores, they can afford to lower the prices on these mass-produced goods. So things aren't tailor-made for people individually anymore. For example, things are going to be standardized. You're going to have things like, specific sizes for a dress or a shirt or whatever. There's a standardization that happens, but then prices can be lowered too, with big businesses moving all this merchandise. So it's this new business model, which I'm only really giving a very general overview of. But then on the consumer side of things, more people are now able to afford more stuff. This is a big moment in the Industrial Revolution because prior to the late 19th century, the workers who were working in the factories, on the railroad lines, or wherever, their lives didn't really improve that much in terms of their homes, what they had in their homes, what they were able to afford. And now in the late 19th century, and then especially into the early 20th century, with mass production and mass consumerism, ordinary people are going to be able to afford more stuff. This tends to be good because now finally ordinary workers have within their reach luxury goods. And this tends to be good for making people happy if they have some creature comforts, and that tends to sap the energy of working class people from wanting to have a revolution. It also, by the time you get to the 20th century, changes how people view their identity. Increasingly, people start judging themselves and others by how much stuff they have. All right, so mass consumerism developing in Paris under Napoleon III, another image here of one of the first shopping markets in Paris. The mass production of clothes. In a future lecture, we will learn more about France's most famous writer of the late 19th century, a man who was very important in both politics and in literature, Émile Zola. And Zola wrote a book called Au Bonheur des Dames, which is sometimes translated as The Lady's Delight. Although more recently, this book was made into a British television show, and it was translated as Lady's Paradise, or The Lady's Paradise, something like that. Never saw the show, so I can't speak for it. But in it, he talked about this new culture of consumerism and of shopping, and women actually got jobs working there as sales ladies. And of course, this is a big development, women being able to go into the workplace. And Zola, very much part of the naturalist movement in literature, he aimed to describe things as realistically as they were, and how women sort of had to dress up themselves, and how they were exploited by their male managers, and just the all-around difficulties and hardships that women had to endure in this new job, all while putting on this facade that everything's just wonderful. Hence the irony in the title, The Lady's Delight, or The Lady's Paradise, or as I look at the French title, Au Bonheur des Dames, The Happiness of Ladies. All right, we will learn more about Émile Zola in a future lecture. All right, so let's talk about art. France, and Paris especially, has always been the center of the art world, but under the reign of Napoleon III, art is controlled by the government. So here's how it worked. There would be one famous national art exhibit. It was put on annually by the Académie des Beaux-Arts, or the National Academy of Fine Arts in France. And if you wanted to have one of your pieces of artwork put on display, you had to submit that artwork, that painting, that statue, whatever, to a committee of men who were in charge of the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Okay, so essentially you had one group of stodgy old men who had their idea of what good art was, and they'd only put your art on display if it met their criteria. So by the time the 1860s roll around, Napoleon III, as Emperor of France, who needs to at least have some inkling of, what's going on artistically, because France is the center of the art world, he starts to sense that there's some frustration, that what's being presented here in the annual Salon of the Académie des Beaux-Arts is a little static. There's not much new. There's nothing very exciting going on. So Napoleon III's response to it was to have another Salon. And it's really simple. Everything that the Académie des Beaux-Arts had refused would be put on display at another salon called the Salon des Refusés, or the Salon of the Refused. It's a great title for an art show, the Salon of the Refused. Here are all the rejects. So this happened in the year 1863. 60% of all submissions to the Académie des Beaux-Arts were rejected. So Napoleon III says, all right, we're going to have our own little salon, the Salon des Refusés. And no surprise here, the Salon of the Refused attracted more visitors than the actual Salon of the Académie des Beaux-Arts. The people of Paris wanted to see the rejects, maybe to make fun of them, maybe just to see, something new, something different, who knows? But this particular event right here is seen as the birth of the artistic movement called Modernism. The most famous painter that emerged out of the Salon of the Refused was this man. His name was Edouard Manet. And we will have a future lecture on modernism and the artistic and intellectual movements of the late 19th century. So I'll probably talk about Manet and the Salon of the Refused again. But let me just, for now, in this lecture, show you one piece of artwork from Manet that people just stopped and looked at. And it was this painting that you see right here. It was called The Lunch on the Grass. Very simple title for what might be a fairly simple scene, but it's just a scene that made people stop and go, huh? What? So Lunch on the Grass features two men and two women, and there's a picnic nearby. But several strange things are going on in it. First of all, one of the women is completely nude, and she's just kind of relaxing there with these two fully clothed men, as if this isn't strange at all. Then you have another woman in the background there who's wading in water, but something doesn't seem right with the proportions in terms of how far out she is into this little lake where she's standing. This piece of artwork was just odd enough to make people stop and look at it and talk about it. They're wondering what's going on. Why aren't things painted in proportion? Maybe this Manet guy is just simply not a good painter. It's certainly not good artwork from the tradition, by any traditional definition. But here's the thing, and this is the beginning of modernism. It's breaking all the rules and it's making people talk. And that's pretty much the definition of modernism, whether you're talking about literature or artwork or philosophy. It's breaking all the rules, but it's making people talk. There's something fascinating about it, something interesting about it. People like to make fun of it. People also find it to be immoral and disgusting in some ways, and that only, of course, generates more enthusiasm and interest in it. And this painting is the one that really gets people to talk and makes Manet the most famous artist in France in 1863. The Lunch on the Grass. Right, and that's it. And that's all I have to say about Napoleon III in this lecture about him and France during his reign. It's a good thing to use to supplement what you're learning about Napoleon III as it relates to the greater scope of European history, in particular, what you learn about Napoleon III as he related to Italian unification and German unification. All right, hey, that's it for this time. Thank you, AP European History students. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.